Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 5 about the executive branch, and it's Lesson 2, which is the second lesson about the assigned powers of the President. In this lesson, you'll learn about the President's treaty-making power, about his appointment power, about the recess appointment power, the veto power, and the pocket veto power. Now let me remind you from the previous lesson, we learned that Article 2 of the Constitution assigns a number of powers to the President, as you can see quoted on this slide. In the previous lesson, we took a chunk of them and went through them in detail. In this lesson, we'll complete going through these assigned powers, again, in separate detail for each of them. The way we're going to divide up our approach to powers in this lesson is to focus on three types of powers. Two of them will have a main power and then a secondary power listed with them. That's why the boxes on this slide are sort of color-coded. Gray for the first power, the reddish color for a main power, then a subsidiary related power, and then the bluish boxes for a main power and another subsidiary related power. So the first power we're going to look at is the President's treaty-making power. In Article 2 of the Constitution, it says that the President shall make treaties. What this is referring to, as it has evolved in American history, is the President's power to negotiate treaties with other countries and then sign them as the President of the United States. But that's only part of the process. For that same part of the Constitution says that the President shall make treaties provided that 2/3 of the senators present concur. What this means is after the President has signed a treaty that he's negotiated, that treaty must be ratified by the Senate by a 2/3 vote. So there's important terminology to recognize in this. While the Constitution doesn't use the words negotiated, signed, and ratified, those are the terms that are commonly used to describe this power. The President negotiates treaties, and then once he's completed negotiations to his satisfaction, he signs the treaty along with the leaders of another country or countries that the treaty is negotiated with. But then the treaty must be approved, or in other words, ratified by the United States Senate by a 2/3 vote before it is binding on the United States of America. A president signing a treaty does not mean that the United States has to obey the treaty. The United States is only obligated to obey that treaty once the Senate has approved it, or in other words, ratified it by its 2/3 vote. The next presidential power for us to talk about is the appointment power. In the Constitution, it says that the President shall appoint, and then it lists a bunch of kinds of offices in government that he can appoint, such as ambassadors and judges on the Supreme Court of the United States. So, for example, Supreme Court justices are nominated by the President. Again, the terminology is important here, because even if the Constitution doesn't use the word nominate, that's the word that's commonly used as we talk about the President selecting Supreme Court justices or people that he appoints to other offices. So this one example is a good way to illustrate it. What you happen to see in the picture here is President George H.W. Bush, who was President of the United States in the late 1980s, nominating Clarence Thomas to serve on the United States Supreme Court. That same passage in the Constitution, in addition to saying that the President can appoint people to these offices, says that he can only do so, though, with the advice and consent of the Senate. Now, the consent part's the really important part. The Senate certainly, at times, will give the President advice before he makes an appointment. And certainly after he makes the appointment, they'll advise him on why they think it was a good or bad idea to pick the particular person that he did. But the essential thing is that the Senate must consent, or in other words, some way approve the President's appointment. The way that's, the terminology, that's used to describe that now in modern America is to say that the Senate confirms these appointments. So, for example, a Supreme Court justice must be confirmed by the Senate. These confirmations of presidential appointments are done by majority vote. In this photo, you can see Clarence Thomas during his Senate hearings before they took a vote on him. He was confirmed to the United States Supreme Court by the closest vote of any Supreme Court justice in history who was successfully placed on the court. But that's a story for some other time. Another way that the president can exercise the appointment power is through what are called recess appointments, which are described separately in the Constitution. In Article 2, after talking about the president's appointment power, which we just discussed, it says that the president can also fill vacancies in some of these offices that he can appoint people to during the recess of the Senate. Now, what this means is that when the Senate is not around in town doing business, for example, they've adjourned at the end of a session or gone home for Christmas vacation or something like that, if there is an opening created in government, such as by the death of a Supreme Court justice, the president could potentially step in and appoint somebody to temporarily serve in that position till the end of the next session of the United States Senate when they return. The original idea behind this was that the United States Senate was only expected to meet for, say, 3 months a year. They'd be gone for long periods during a time of poor communications and slow transportation at the time of the founding of the United States of America. So potentially the president could be sitting in Washington, D.C. with important offices left empty for months at a time. And so it gave a way for him to temporarily appoint people to those positions till the Senate could return and permanently confirm somebody to that place. The next power to discuss that the president has is the veto power. This is a power that we've discussed previously in this course, how every bill that is passed by Congress has to be eventually approved and signed by the president before it can become a law. So, while the president may sign bills into law, the Constitution goes on to say he doesn't have to. In fact, if he chooses not to, according to the Constitution, he's supposed to then return the bill to Congress for them to reconsider it and potentially override his veto, as we discussed in the unit about Congress and how they make bills become laws. So this process of the president not signing a law and instead returning to Congress is what we now today call a veto. So the presidential veto, really technically speaking, is the president returning a law to Congress with some sort of explanation for why he was unwilling to sign it. That then gives Congress the potential opportunity to overrule him by a 2/3 vote of both houses, as we discussed in Unit 4. The last power to talk about in this lesson, related to the veto power, is the pocket veto power. This is another power that we previously discussed when we talked about the lawmaking function of Congress. The pocket veto power, along with the veto power, isn't discussed in Article 2 of the Constitution, like the other presidential powers are. Instead, it appears in Article 1, because it's integrated into the legislative process, so it appears in Article 1, which deals with the legislative branch. Nonetheless, it is a true power of the president to veto a law by returning it to Congress. In the case of the pocket veto, the president is, first of all, given a 10-day window of time in which he is supposed to make a decision on a law, whether or not to approve it or veto it. Now, if that 10-day window expires without the president acting, then that bill becomes a law. But there's an exception to that provided in that same passage, and that is if Congress, by their adjournment, prevents the president from returning the law to them. And remember, he's given 10 days to potentially do this. What this really means is if Congress adjourns or leaves town before those 10 days have expired that the president's been given, and he simply refuses to act on the bill, rather than it automatically becoming a law, it automatically shall not be a law. This then is what we call the pocket veto. So the way to think about it is that if a bill is sent to the president with less than 10 days before Congress adjourns, and he chooses not to sign it or return it, then it's going to die. It's going to be effectively vetoed. But he did that not by actively doing anything with the bill. The reason it's called a pocket veto is the imagery is of him getting the bill, shoving it in his pocket, and then just ignoring it. And in that way, killing it. So let's review what we learned in this lesson. Who negotiates treaties? Is it the House of Representatives, the United States Senate, the President of the United States, or the United States Supreme Court? It's the President of the United States that negotiates treaties. What is required to approve a presidential appointment? Is it just the presidential signature? Is it a Senate majority, a House majority, or a Supreme Court majority for approval? The United States Constitution requires a Senate majority to approve the president's appointments. Remember, the way it's described today is that the president nominates somebody to some position, and then the Senate confirms them. What is a recess appointment? Is an appointment made when the Senate is not in session? Is an appointment made right after an election? Or one made after a long deliberation? Or one made right before an election? A recess appointment is made when the Senate is not in session. What does a veto do? Does it forever kill a bill? Or does it send the bill back to the Congress? Or does it approve a bill? Or does it change a bill's content? Remember, a veto is technically the president just sending the bill back to Congress without his signature. The Constitution also asks that he includes his reasons for not signing it. That way, the Congress has an opportunity potentially to overrule his refusal to sign it. When may a pocket veto happen? Is it when Congress is adjourned? 6 weeks before an election? Or when Congress overrides a veto? Or when the Supreme Court can't decide an issue? A pocket veto may happen when Congress is adjourned. So the idea is Congress sends the president a bill to sign, and then they leave town before 10 days have elapsed. And he's supposed to have 10 days to consider it and send it back to him. Well, they aren't there to send it back to him anymore, so if he just ignores it, it automatically dies, just like a veto would kill it. Okay, that completes this lesson 2 from Unit 5. The next lesson from Unit 5 is Lesson 3, concerning the President's extra constitutional powers.